G'day, I'm Gary, and this is how I built this simple portable trellis. I needed something that I could move around and assemble pretty quickly, so I decided to build this trellis using some simple materials that are readily available. Perhaps you've got a balcony, a deck, maybe a patio. You may have an area on the side of your house that you don't think you can grow anything in. You may have a backyard that's covered in concrete. You might have blacktop. Perhaps your soil is contaminated. I can think of a number of places where a trellis like this might come in handy. It can be scaled down to fit a smaller space. It could be scaled up to cover a larger area. For the frame, I used 1/2-inch EMT electrical conduit. I attached them using these corner pieces. These corner pieces are used for pulling electrical wiring through. So they simply attach to the top. Got a couple of simple screws and that's done. So I've got this frame. I needed to span at least 5 feet. That's the distance from one end of these totes to the other. So I decided to make 2 of these frames. The electrical conduit comes in 10-foot lengths, so I cut 3 10-foot lengths in half. That gave me enough material for 2 frames. For the base, I needed 1 60-pound bag of pre-mixed concrete. Half of the concrete went into one base, half went into the other. These were the first ones that I built. The way I made the formwork for them, I took a floral pot that I get from a local florist. I cut the base out using a pair of scissors. I started the cut with a craft knife, then I removed the base, then I turned it upside down. By turning it upside down, that makes it very stable. With this one, I put a piece of 1/2-inch by 20-inch rebar. I made a couple of handles by bending some 3/8 rebar. To bend the 3/8 rebar, I simply spaced the pipe that I used to bend it with about 4 inches apart. That gave me more of a radius than a corner, so that made it easy to lift. After I made the first ones, I thought that I could make some modifications and make it a little bit more usable. So instead of using the rebar and putting it straight into the concrete, I took some short pieces of 1/2-inch EMT pipe and I put those in the center. On the bottom of the EMT pipe I attached some electrical tape, and then I didn't push it in all the way. I only pushed it in a certain distance down. So the bottom of the EMT pipe is a couple of inches above the bottom of the concrete. By having the EMT pipe, I can put a 24-inch piece of 1/2-inch rebar in, or alternatively, we could use garden stakes and sit the garden stakes in the center. To keep it centered, I drilled a hole in a piece of plywood, and that did 2 things. It kept the pipe centered, and it also holds the humidity in and allows the concrete to cure slowly. By allowing the concrete to cure more slowly, you're going to end up with a stronger finished concrete. To make sure the molds didn't shift, I took a piece of plywood, I leveled it out, and I attached the molds to the plywood using screws. So using a wheelbarrow, I mixed the concrete. I added equal amounts to each mold. I waited a couple of days before I removed the molds. The molds that I'm using, I don't bother with coating the insides. I've found that the floral pots, because they're tapered, I can remove them fairly easily. If I was going to use a plant pot or a bucket, I would coat the insides with oil because the surface is a little rougher on the plant pot. The other thing with a bucket, because it's not tapered, it might be hard to remove the concrete from the mould. So if you're going to use a bucket, I'd definitely use oil to coat the inside, and that way you could remove the concrete from the mould a lot easier. The moulds can be used a number of times. I simply rinse them after each use. If you watch our channel, you'll see that my wife Robbie and I are big on recycling and repurposing. To make it easier to cut things, I made this little jig up. It's just a couple of scrap pieces of 2x4s that are screwed to some plywood. So I've got a couple of little pieces of plywood on the bottom just to elevate it off the ground. So I use this to cut the 3/8 rebar and thicker gauges of rebar and up to 3/4 of an inch EMT pipe. So I made it wide enough so I can drop a piece of EMT pipe in. The way I cut it, I simply line it up with the edge of this piece of 2x4. Then I clamp it. So I lift it up a little bit, line it up with the 2x4, clamp it. All I have to do now is cut it with the hacksaw. The 2x4 acts as a straight edge and a guide, so the hacksaw can just cut straight through it and you'll get a nice square cut. Alternatively, if I'm in a hurry, I can just put it straight on it. From there, all I have to do is bend it. So I just want a little bit of a loop on this. And there's my hook. I'm going to set up a couple of these using some wire fencing. Now to string the wire fencing onto the rebar hooks, I took some scrap electrical wire. It doesn't matter what gauge it is. This is 12 gauge and you can buy it in the rolls if you wanted to. This would last a lifetime. But I always seem to have scraps of it lying around, so I took some of this. I chose green because I had green, but if you use black, that will disappear. So I took a piece, maybe 4 inches long. I bent it in half. And using the pliers, I simply looped it around the rebar, tightened it up with the pair of pliers, bent it vertically. So now that I've got a hook that I can hang the wire from, so I put 2 pieces at the same distance from the top. Then it's just a matter of turning it around. Now I've got the hook for the wire to sit on. This bonds really tight to the rebar, electrical wire. If you tighten it up, it'll really grip, so that'll last a long time. I would use the plastic coated. Once I've got that set up, it's just a matter of lifting the wire. This is fencing wire that you can buy by the roll. I cut it down to size and I flattened it out. So now I've got this little hook that holds it in position. Now from here, all I have to do is take more of these clips that I made, position this where I want it, and just loop it around and tighten it up. So once I get this all tightened up, now I've got this little frame that I can lift on and off, and I could even roll it up if I wanted to at the end of the season. I could coil it up for storage or leave it flat. This would be a good frame for growing beans on, or even melons. If you had this up against a wall, you might want to choose larger wire. This is 2 by 4, and it might be difficult to reach fruit through it. I know some people use the rebar mesh or the cattle panels, and that would work also. So you've got bigger squares for that. So this is how I'm going to set it up, because where I'm setting it up in my main garden, I'll be able to get around it so I can get to both sides. And often the fruit will form in the shady side of a vine. So this side will be leaves, and this side will be where the fruit can be collected. Now that I've got a frame, I've got a few other options, ways I can set this up. I could use one rebar hook and I could train tomatoes, cucumbers or beans up it. If you didn't like the look of rebar, or you don't have access to cut the rebar, you could also use a garden stake. And with the garden stake, what I've done here is I've attached a screw hook to the end of the garden stake using a hose clamp. So the hose clamp holds the hook to the stake, and it's just a matter of hanging it off the trellis support. I'm not going to use that, but that is an option. Now with the support, I could also hang rebar and create a grid. What I've done here is I've tied a piece of electrical wire to the rebar. I've tightened it up so it's got a firm grip to it. I've made a hook that goes upwards, and I can set a piece of rebar across there on both sides, and that supports it, and all I have to do now is tie it together. So I can tie it together really tight, and once I've got it tied together, that's not going to go anywhere. So now that's locked this into place. And with this locked in, I could continue down, adding pieces of rebar all the way down. If I wanted to, I could create a grid, so I could have a grid going down. Another option that I could have is take some rebar hooks, connect them in the center, and create a V. And once I created a V, again I could take other pieces of rebar and work my way up. I could also put a plant in the center and fan it out using different rebar hooks that I could hang off the top there. I could support it that way. So I've got a number of options and a few different configurations I can work with. The rebar I like to hang on the inside of the frame. That way there's no sharp edges, no place where you can walk into. If you want to, you can take a file and clear that off. There are caps for rebar that you can get at the hardware store if you want to put a little cap on the end. There are other parts that you can get for the EMT piping. You can get elbows, 90-degree elbows. You could attach that to the end, and then you'd have a round edge. You just have to get the couplings to attach it to the pipe. I've used that in some of my bigger trellises. When you start going into the 3/4 of an inch size, the corner pieces start to get a little pricey. So I've been using the elbows, inserting them inside and attaching them that way. This trellis frame takes up a space of 6 feet by 2 feet, and it's a little over 5 foot tall. You could scale it down if you have a smaller space. If you've got a deck or a balcony or something like that, you could totally make something smaller and make something that would fit the space that you've got available. If you had a bigger space, you could make it larger. If I would make it larger, I would go with the 3/4 of an inch EMT because it's a lot more sturdier. This has a little bit more flex to the larger pieces. So you've got a few different diameters that you could work with. I've chosen 1/2 inch for this one because it doesn't have to support a lot. If I was going to have it on a large scale, I would definitely go with the larger pipe. especially if you had a lot of tomatoes or something heavy like melons that you were going to support, pumpkin, squash, whatever. Anyhow, growing vertically is something that I'm doing already with my garden, but I want to expand that out and set up different trellises like this in different locations. I'm also going into tote gardening, and this suits the tote gardening very well. It'll also work when I start setting up some of my new self-watering wicking beds. So my self-watering wicking beds will have something in the center, and I'll be able to grow straight up. I hope I've given you something to think about. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more videos on our channel, that's Robbie and Gary Gardening Easy. Feel free to look over our channel. Robbie's got a lot of videos up, I've got a few up, and I'm trying to get a few more together. With that, thanks for watching, and don't forget to eat what you grow.